Hi, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful networking break. I know that I was in one of the networking sessions and it was really a great discussion there. So I hope you all enjoyed the same. And I want to welcome you back to join our panel, Technology Blind Spots for the Competitive Intelligence Community. And here I have my fellow CI fellow, Richard Caldwell, who will be moderating this session with Olga Holin, the founder at White Husky, and Charlene Chambliss, who is a part of Primer AI. And so I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Richard.
Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to jump in on this here. So we want to talk a little bit about blind spots, but we kind of want to talk about AI and machine learning and how that would impact our business with that technology. So let me prep this a little bit. A lot of us are familiar with using four corners analysis, right? And so that goes back to the classic book on structured analytical techniques by Richard Hauer and Randolph Pearson, where they talked about two types of thinking. And so what I really like about competitive intelligence is not just looking at markets and competitors and diving into financial reports. There's psychology to it, right? And that's where I think that AI can help us get through some of that fog that's out there. So they address two types of thinking. System one is the fast thinking, the intuitive, unconscious. Just make a decision. I've got experience and I can do that. And system two is the cognitive, deliberate, where you're thinking about things. So Michael Porter took that and built on what we call four corners analysis. And it's the second or the first type, the systems one thinking, where I think AI can probably help us a little bit. And I go back to the book by Craig Fleischer and Babette Benelson that talked about a lot of our competitive analytical tools. And they address in there one of the best places that we can get competitive information is from four corners analysis, where we're looking at blind spots. That's looking at our competitors and seeing what assumptions that they are making about themselves. And I'm hoping that the AI tools can help us to do that. The way I typically do that is I'll go and read about the company. What are they bragging about? What are they saying about themselves? They'll say, I'm a technology company, but are they? Are they really? What does it look like? And then that's where I find the blind spots. So hopefully that can help us out. It gives us predictive behavior. All right. So that's one of the areas. But what I want to do is kind of go around the corner here and have Olga and Charlene talk a little bit about what they think about this. We talked briefly last week, and Charlene has a couple ideas as well. So, Olga, I'm going to turn this over to you. I'm going to start this off and ask you a question here, and then you can take it where you want to go. Right.
Okay.
So, a lot of times when I typically think about AI, it's supposed to help us with gathering data, right? Better data, gathering it, filtering it, providing warning, visualizing the trends and pattern recognition. I'm real interested in that pattern recognition thing. So I'm wondering if you could probably elaborate from your experience on how AI could do that.
Okay. I'll try and use an example. So I spent pretty much most of my career working for analyst houses and then joined BT for a while. And I focus specifically on how to translate the information or kind of how to make it available to users in a way that actually gets absorbed into a business, into the organization, and kind of
I think she froze a little bit there and dropped on us. So we'll continue on here. And when Olga gets us back, we'll let her finish. So Charlene, you were talking about the evolution a little bit of the computers and how the natural language is processing and things like that. I'm interested in that. Where are we going with this?
Yeah, great question. So I'm a senior machine learning engineer at Primer, and we are in the business of essentially turning unstructured data, such as text that you would find in basically any kind of document. Maybe it's a PowerPoint, maybe it's your Google Doc, maybe it's your company's internal documentation, something like that. We turn all of that just massive amount of text into structured data, and we also empower people to build their own models that can actually take structured data out of that unstructured data. And so an example of what I mean by that is, say that you have an algorithm that can identify all the people, locations, organizations, and miscellaneous entities inside of a piece of text. If you could extract all of that data from, say, 1,000 documents, then you would immediately kind of be able to get a sense of every single one of those documents. Like, what is this document about? Who are they talking about? What happened here? Things like that. And so that's a standard task that we would call named entity recognition in natural language processing. And it's just one example of how you can essentially use these algorithms to automate tasks that would otherwise take a very long time, maybe 5 minutes or more per document, which really adds up at scale, and allow us to basically supercharge humans and let them kind of spend more time on the analysis part rather than of just the getting the information out of the documents part.
So you said machine learning, and we'll get back to you a second here, Olga. We had this discussion a little bit yesterday. It was brought up. What's the difference between machine learning, and AI?
Yeah, so machine learning is actually a subset of AI. So artificial intelligence encompasses essentially any system that kind of aims to automate a process or make a process more straightforward. Machine learning is kind of a specific mathematical approach where you're maybe applying a particular kind of mathematical algorithm or an optimization process rather than just applying something like rules or logic, like if-else statements or something like that. If this, then do that. If this, then classify it as that. Machine learning kind of learns all of those things more implicitly. So it can kind of, like you guys were talking about, it can kind of pattern recognize rather than being explicitly told what to do.
Okay. So I want to bring this up later, but there's a tool I really like out there. I call it string technology. It's the IFTTN, if this, then that, right? And I really think there's a lot of promise in that. But let's go back to Olga, and we dropped off there, and we were talking a little bit about pattern recognition and warning. What is AI going to do for us in competitive intelligence?
It can actually do a lot. Just ironically, in technology we trust, internet not trustworthy today with 2 connections, but it's a question. So the thing that I always say to people is like, go back to what do you want it to do? Go back to the business objective, because when we're at BT, we implemented a new platform to access the insight that has a bunch of AI and machine learning behind it. But the focus was always around, what do we want to achieve and why are we doing this in the first place? Can you still hear me, even though the image is not working? Okay. There are a lot of pitfalls. I've seen so many kind of technology implementations fail because people get carried away. They talk to the suppliers are heavily focused on features, and then it all falls apart when the data can't be cleaned properly or it can't be used properly because of data protection laws and so on. So it's a lengthy process, and somehow it's a little bit like going hungry into a supermarket. You become aware that you might need a technology, and you go in and everybody comes at you, and you've got the chocolate section, you've got this, and then you come home, you can't really put together a dinner because none of the things work together. And by the way, you're not really hungry anymore because you ate the baguettes like in the car because you were so hungry, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't stick together. So the number one thing I say, once you become aware that you have a need, is just think about it, what the real business objective is, why are you doing it? And then find a technology partner that understands that. So for instance, when we worked with Cogni to implement it, the head of development, Kevin, would always say, you can do anything, with technology, you can code anything, but does it make sense to do it? And, to have a partner who kind of makes you take a step back and makes you focus on what is actually essential kind of in that system, you can do anything. And then, once you take it back and you focus on the business objective, then you can see about how you're going to get there, with the understanding that it's not going to happen overnight. Machine learning, the machine needs to learn. It needs to have points and interactions and data interactions in order to be able to learn. So if we look at the BT Insight Hub today, it does that. there's a section, it recommends, research based on people's profiles, a bit like an Amazon kind of, more like this. If you like this, you might like that. It took time to work, and it's still, if a document is new, it will not have any recommendations because it just hasn't got those points. So, you can build the most complicated system designed to do everything. If it's not usable because people don't understand how to access the data, if that is not simple, if they can't, get access to it, or they have to jump through so many hoops to get there, then it's not going to be used. And this is when the implementations failed, because you kind of, you don't understand kind of, why it's not working. And I've seen a lot of examples where, the technology does never get launched, because, what's the point of launching something that is too complicated and doesn't work? Or it gets launched and then they wonder, well, why don't we have any users actually consuming it, using it, and doing around that? So I think it's a little bit more complicated in terms of looking, what is it we're doing, why, and how, who will be accessing it, and who is your target audience in order to make it happen. And then based on that, you can kind of try to mitigate it, go in knowing that things will go wrong. They always do. It's just kind of, but the more complicated it is, the more likely they are, to go wrong, and the more difficult it will be to find where it has gone wrong, because there's so many elements to it. So yeah.
So let me let me address a concern that I have and some of my colleagues have, and when we're doing our competitive analysis. All right, and to me, it goes back to pattern recognition. I'm a real big fan of a guy, John Boyd, who did the OODA loop thing, but it's a lot more complicated than that. He used a lot of computer processing, and he had this thing called the patterns briefing. And basically, he was looking at behavior, patterns of behavior. All right. And so bringing that into, competitive intelligence, I want to look at the patterns of behavior of my competitors to see what kind of blind spots they have. So typically the way we're going to do that is we'll watch and wait for a market shock, right? It could be anything. It can be a pandemic. Wow. It could be that the stock market drops. Maybe there's a merger and acquisition that goes on out there. Anything that disturbs the pond that you're operating in. I call it, the market, the pond. And so then I look closely and see what are my competitors doing? Are they reacting, or do they have a plan in place? Is there a way that I could use AI or machine learning to look at those patterns of behavior and give me alerts like something's going on here? This is not normal for them. Charlene, you're shaking your head. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this actually sounds very similar to a common use case for some of our customers in the finance sector. So what they'll often use our platform for is kind of portfolio monitoring. And so maybe they have a portfolio of companies they've invested in. They want to make sure those companies are doing okay. So they actually build classifiers that can identify different types of risks that might be facing those companies. And so as news comes in about those companies, we can identify whenever something has come up in the news that might be a threat to that company, or that something interesting has happened with that company. And we can automatically surface that anytime that you're doing a search, for example.
Sometimes those things are very subtle, aren't they? Is AI and machine language, can we tune that to pick up the subtleties? And sometimes this stuff, you'll read it, you'll go through it, and August Jackson was talking yesterday about the tools he was using. I use many of the same ones like Feedly, and there's a lot of material there. But so I'll go back and read it, and I go, oh, I missed this. Yeah, okay. Is there a way we can tune it so we can pick up those subtle items?
Time. So for me, yeah, I'd say you probably can. It will take time, because it needs to understand those nuances. And I think the struggle with it is that it with corporations, you don't to pick up that cognitive stuff, it usually comes with people. So you can start trying to gather information on specific people and profiling them in that way, and segment them, I suppose. But I don't think it will be foolproof. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm just thinking, how would I go about doing it? And I think, it would take some time. I would probably not leave it entirely to the technology. There is a way in which you can do a phase, approach in which you start, it to work, and then you have human intervention, and then, the human can kind of look at it a little bit more, and then you build kind of, the patterns to recognize, to actually see whether it is something meaningful or not. So I would probably phase it and do it that way. Depending how deep kind of, and detailed you want it to be. Because I think that's the one thing. It might go wrong, it might go right, but you need to troubleshoot along the way.
So Brian Fuller just posted a thing that I've thought about quite a bit. I think a lot of analysts, it's on their minds, is pattern recognition. When we're out there looking at different things that are happening, we want to have some predictive analytics applied to that. We want to kind of get a little sense for what's next for them. What are our competitors going to do next? Based on the trends and where they're going, if this happens, what's going to happen next? Is there anything that's out there now that's useful that we can do predictive analytics using AI? Charlene, I'll throw this one at you.
I'm actually not in the business of predictive analytics, so maybe Olga might be better to talk about this one.
I've seen a few implementations, some that work, some that don't work. You can do things how you can predict how your customers can potentially, receive an offer and kind of, do that. So you just kind of, build it, but it's not foolproof. And I think the problem that you face is that I'm currently working with a company. We're looking at social media tracking specifically, and competitive tracking, and kind of, one easy dashboard in order to do that. And it's a request that I get fairly frequently. It's really hard to do, especially when you want to include, analysts and bloggers writing about, identifying, who's writing what. The difficulty there is again, which information do you source? Do you take it, what parts of the internet do you scrape for the information? Do you get, which terminology do you look for kind of, in Twitter? Because you have to have a baseline where you start. And so you have to give that information to whatever system will be doing that. But then, this again is kind of a human specific. And then based on that will then kind of, go and develop and find own kind of, terms, and will be able to do that down the line. But you have to start somewhere. And then with the internet being so vast, you kind of have to make decisions about the sources you'll be using. And then when it comes to that, like, any implementation that you do, the data sets are not standardized. So the information you might get back will be a mess. So you need to kind of make sure that the sources you feed in, are clean and are done for. And to give you an example, we were working with a specific analyst house to kind of, do research on the BT system and so on. And when companies use tags like the, and, or, it creates a whole nightmare, because, if you want to search for 5G and enterprise and competitors, you type it in, it would flag everything with an and, so you have to do a lot of work in the background in the coding to make sure that that information is disregarded. It's not what you need. And so it doesn't happen overnight. You still need to give it a base information so that it functions and can learn and kind of review and do that. And then, sources are not all the same. There are some that you might regard higher kind of thing. So you might want to prioritize, some of the sources, put them higher, and then deprioritize some others where you're not so happy, for example, with a methodology or things that they use, but they might still kind of input interesting information, but kind of it needs to be cross-checked. So I think that's kind of, anything can be done, but it falls, unfortunately, it often falls apart with the data sources and the vast kind of, definitions you have out in the market.
So let's talk about sources. You mentioned social media there, and there's some discussion on the side here. Something that I've seen, because I'm in the aerospace defense industry. In fact, I saw this as late as 2 weeks ago. Went to the Army conference, AUSA, and a lot of the Army intelligence agencies were using social media to flag potential, unrest and things like that out in different areas, so they could, be tipped off on that. But as we all know, Twitter is 100% accurate, right? and there's no issues with that. How do you screen out those false positives, or even somebody that's, doing the data stuffing and putting in messaging that is not true and trying to, sway, people? How do you do that? Do we have tools that can do that, Charlene?
Yeah, absolutely, actually. So we have a platform that does exactly this. We have kind of a real-time dashboard that's plugged directly into news and social media, and it does things like detect unrest and detect like humanitarian emergencies and other things going on around the world. Um, One machine learning model that I actually built that went into that platform was a bot detection model that essentially can detect whenever a given Twitter account might be actually run by like some kind of automated algorithm, or it's run by, maybe a Russian agency somewhere. But it basically has a pattern of like inauthentic activity. And you can actually use the metadata associated with the Twitter account, feed that into the model, and the model will tell you like this account is likely fake. And so that's one way that you can screen out some of the false positives. The other way is just ensuring to include that in your training data set when you're looking at training a classification model that detects those kinds of events. So you want to make sure that you're including tweets that are maybe, a joke or sarcastic or something like that, and feeding that to the model as a negative so that it knows not to kind of pick that up as like a real thing that's happening. And so, as Olga said, the data sources are very important. Curating your data is very important, making sure that you're not mislabeling examples or like kind of giving the model the wrong impression of what to look for. So as long as you take care with those things, you can actually achieve very high precision and recall when it comes to looking for these types of events.
On that note, the one thing that I'll say, that even with the bots, it's again, it's not going to be foolproof because the influencing factor. So it depends on what you look at. If you look at, something that might, influence consumer behavior, for instance, then the bots will still likely be able to do that, because the normal user out there will not go and check if it's a bot and will trust the information. We went from like 10 years ago where you'd say you wouldn't book a hotel without looking at reviews. Usually when you read the reviews and you only read 5-star reviews, you don't trust that either. So, you have kind of some level of understanding that a lot of the reviews are fake, they're out there. But again, so it depends what you want to do with it. So it might recognize it's a bot, but it might not actually, matter to you that it is in some cases on that. So.
Yeah, so curation is an important thing of your data sources. So, you probably all familiar with the book by Kathy O'Neill, Weapons of Math Destruction, right? Where she talks about how data is being used in some circumstances, and it's it's making it harder for the underprivileged because the way they're focusing the data, and especially with colleges and universities, it got to the point where the reason, the way that the college and universities increased their reputation was by increasing their prices, right? It costs more to go here, so obviously we're a better college, right? So I mean, there's ways that data can be used incorrectly, and so that's one of the things that I'm concerned with. I mean, we have so many sources out there, and I'm always curating my sources, right? And and I'm aerospace defense industry. They're usually pretty good. But every once in a while, I'll see one starting to go off track, and they're not discussing the news anymore. They're kind of going off on a tangent, a political tangent, and stuff like that, and it kind of pollutes the the sourcing, the information I need to get. So please tell me, are curation, is that manual, or are you using AI tools to do curation?
You could, so there are certain things that you can do automated kind of thing. You can write that if the data says this, to treat it like this, and so on. So there's a lot of that kind of going on. It's kind of where you would probably go and look at it manually is when you get error codes, when certain kind of patterns just don't work anymore, or don't kind of don't get logged, and you get kind of error logs, essentially trying to understand that. But there's a lot of things you can do to automate kind of the data cleaning and so on. But again, it needs to kind of have similar definitions, and kind of or at least kind of account for if the definitions are not the same, what does it actually mean, kind of, and how do you treat the kind of the errors that come through.
Okay.
Yeah,
Darlene,
this is kind of a hot topic right
Yeah.
now in ML. Is how do you go about actually detecting when the data going into your model is sort of drifting away from the space that it used to occupy? And so there are some automated ways of doing that, like essentially statistical analysis. So if you expect the variable X to be within 0 and 100, and then all of a sudden all your data points coming in are 200. Then you can detect that falling outside of the usual range, and then you can kind of automate what was my previous data's range, and then compare that to the new data coming in. But in other ways, in fact, in our field, natural language processing, that can be a lot harder, because how do you detect whether like a news article seems different than the news article from last year? And so that is a little bit harder, and I think kind of an unsolved problem in the industry.
Yeah,
I think I always go ahead, Olga. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of, there's still things like language patterns and even kind of speech to text that are very, very flawed in kind of info processing, and are probably the hardest to do in kind of in any implementation.
Yeah, I always try to detect the original source. In my industry, it's kind of easy. There's this news agency called PRN. You're probably, if you're familiar with it. And basically, you pay them, you write the article, you pay them, they publish it to make it look like it was something that a reporter wrote, when in all actuality, that company did that. And then those things get reprinted and populated, and you can follow this train going, oh, that's back to this original announcement here. And okay, that's marketing. There may be some news in there, but there's also marketing involved in there. And so they're trying to get that, source or that information out. So trying to trace those sources is real important to us. Is there anything that AI and machine language could do to help us trace original source material?
I suppose you could, if it's quoted. I mean, you have a lot of news outlets these days that use a lot of automatic writing, so kind of automatically populated articles that then are just kind of edited and published out, and it's kind of it's done for acceleration of speed. So essentially, kind of to get news out faster than they would need to. You could potentially look for common phrases, to try and identify the source articles, and then look at the timestamps, when it was published. And so, yes, you could work it back. The question is, would you want to, for what purpose would you be doing it, and what would you get out of it? I think it might be easier to just simplify the system instead of scanning kind of, all the sources. Just take the ones that you actually trust and verify and work with those to kind of, find the patterns and work with somebody. Yeah. So that's kind of, I would say, instead of trying to clear up all the data, and all these weird sources, just keep it simple, stick to the sources that you trust, and then, use some algorithm for scraping kind of for the other things, and kind of, but try to qualify it that way rather than trying to search for everything. And yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of on my mind, because a lot of times I'll present something about a competitor, say, oh, they did this, they invested here and that, and I'll actually get our executives go, where did you get that information? Right, so they want to see the source, and when I apply it, they go, oh, that's something they wrote themselves, and they're all skeptical, right? And so now I have to go dig and find out, well, is what they said true? Did they really invest the money? So I'm pulling up financial reports, I'm looking for those type of things. So to me, that source material is important, because at least for my executives, if a competitor says they've done something, they don't believe it. They say, oh, that's probably marketing. That's marketing, and I've got to go chase that now, right?
Yeah. I mean, there is a thing such as plagiarism software, kind of, so you could probably use some of those tools and kind of expand it, kind of thinking, kind of, in terms of implementations. That's how a lot of universities check if their students are, honest, or whatever, and it can tell you to the point that, this if you get like anything under 10% of kind of similar pattern recognition in kind of, in the text, then it's probably okay. If it's above that, it can highlight which phrases are kind of essentially the problem in the text. So you could use a form of that and kind of just expand on that technology to do that.
Okay. So I'm going to jump here to a question that August Jackson just brought up. And maybe this will be one for you, Charlene. He says, I wonder what signals machine language powered systems would use to qualify reliability or credibility of a source or a piece of information.
Yeah, this is a problem that we've thought a lot about at Primer because we did a lot of work on disinformation over the last year and trying to detect disinformation in the news and in social. One thing that's really hard about this is that there isn't actually an objective definition of disinformation. It kind of depends on what perspective you're coming at it from and like what you would consider to be disinformation. And so it's still a very sort of human in the loop type of process where maybe the human is not, doing everything, but the human is the one that kind of decides like what features of a piece of communication are associated with it being disinformation, such as like the source that it came from and like, what country is the source based in, and what are the publishing patterns of that source and what kinds of topics does that source usually talk about. And so there are kinds of different features that humans can decide to feed into the system. But ultimately, a fully automated, ML system can't decide on its own, like what is disinformation and what's not.
Okay. So I want to kind of address a little bit where the field is going in the future, what it looks like for us. And what tipped me off on that was just yesterday. It was there was a DoD conference, okay, and the DoD has a chief information officer who's acting right now, Dr. Kelly Fleisch, I believe it is, and Fletcher, Dr. Kelly Fletcher, and she was addressing a crowd of folks at TechNet Cyber Conference, and she said that they're going to start deploying data and AI teams to the COCOMs. So COCOMs are what we call combatant commands, right? And so they have teams now that are going to be working on your data, coming out and helping you understand your data. And what she said was, we want to make sure it's the right time, the right information at the right speed, so you can make the right decision, right? And the AI teams are going to come out there and help you somehow sift through this data. I'd like to see what those deployment teams look like. But as we move to the future, what type of profession, what backgrounds are we going to need in the future to work through all this, data information, data management, data science, artificial intelligence? What are the degrees? What are we looking at? Where's this going?
Do you want to start, or
I can start. Yes. So obviously right now, most of the people in the field have backgrounds in very math heavy subjects. So you have people coming from areas like statistics, applied math, physics, other sciences, and then getting, advanced degrees in some of those topics, maybe even in data science itself. And that's mainly just because the tools are very like computational and hard to use right now. But the tools are only getting easier and easier to use. In fact, one tool that we work on is actually it's like an auto ML platform where you can actually go in and build your own models without any code. And so rather than, going to school and spending 2 years learning Python, now you can basically just click in an interface and then upload your data, and your model will basically figure out like what your data is trying to tell you. And so over time, we're actually seeing a maturation of the space where, more and more people who are maybe just really good problem solvers and critical thinkers, rather than people who necessarily have like specific tech skills, are actually empowered to go in and make more use of these technologies.
Yeah. From my point of view, I haven't got a maths or statistic background. I have a background in which I really kind of, try to find solutions kind of, to problems and try to do it in a way that they actually work and they are user friendly and they, have the type. So it's really about the interconnect of, what you do with it, the interface between human and kind of, technology that comes from it. And I think there's kind of, a lot of talk about, is AI going to, replace, humans and machine learning, are humans going to become obsolete? And we hear a lot about that. And I think, that's maybe perhaps the wrong way to look at it. Technology is there to enhance the human experience, to kind of, be able to, if you're able to automate certain things, it means that you're able to do more with your time. So, from, simple implementations and you still need to give the technology to kind of what it says on the basis of whatever you decide for a business case. And I like to kind of quote kind of a case, for example, in years back, Google gave you the opportunity to check what your characterized it in their system. And my sister went and did that, and she is a particle physicist. She's very good at statistics and coding and everything. And she went and it said that she was a 70-year-old male. And at the time she was, mid 30s, into her gardening. And, so I asked her, is it a problem for you? And she says, well, all I receive is kind of gardening ads. So it doesn't kind of, really matter. So there's an element that, even if the technology is not perfect, it still will help you kind of, further. But you still need kind of a human in the end to decide the parameters of how the technology works and how it applies to the business case. And I think people who think that, technology will be able to make the decisions, and there's a lot, if you look, for example, at smart buildings, it's a simple example, but, you have information. So, for example, what does the system, do if there is a fire, even as simple things like that. So there's a fire on one of the floors, the fire alarm detects it. Then what does it do? Does it send an email to the site manager? Does it contact, the fire station? Depending on kind of the size of fire it is, it might not need it yet. So there's lots of things that you can do after that, but you still need to set it up. There is not one answer that fits everybody, helps everybody along to make kind of, things happen. You still need kind of to have an understanding to set it up, have a processes that actually fit into the organization and the organizational culture, or kind of all that has the best outcome. So even, with those, there are things that you have to teach it. So I think it's about kind of creating roles where you have this intersect, where you can understand what the business case is, what it is meant to do, and you work, line in line with technology to make it happen in a kind of, honest conversation, and kind of, and I suppose you don't get carried away either. You kind of keep yourself in track to make sure you deliver what you want it to be.
Okay. So I'm going to address some of the conversations that are going on here in the chat here, and we have some time left to do that. So Cynthia asked this question here: what do we see in terms of strengths and vulnerabilities in code, low code, in reference to detecting blind spots and intelligence gaps and things like that? So maybe we can look at this in a different way. So one of the things that I often look through, and so my colleagues, and we're trying to find out what are the intelligence gaps, right? What are the intelligence gaps that we need internally to make good decisions? And we, develop, of course, key intelligence topics, and we go out there and look at those. So we're looking at the competitors. We're trying to detect what is it that they're not seeing? What is it they're missing here? What pattern recognition could I look at to see what my competitors are missing about this pursuit? We're both going after it. Why is it they're charging this and they had a different solution than we do? There's got to be something. Either we have a gap and a blind spot, or they do. So what can we use out there? What can we do to understand better from open source? And what gaps are out there, and how can we detect those? Charlie?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think specifically from the lens of text and kind of open source information, say news articles coming in about sort of what your competitors are working on, what they're claiming about their products. there are ways to apply algorithms to actually extract particular topics that maybe occur pretty frequently. You know, particular phrases, words that the competitors may be talking about that might indicate like, oh, maybe they're targeting somewhat of a different persona than we are, or maybe they're targeting kind of supporting a feature set that's maybe less expensive to build because they may not, or maybe it's a feature set that's more rules based because they don't actually have the talent to build out like in a more machine learning algorithmic solution. And so there may be kind of indicators that you can find in just the way that it's being talked about that might suggest what's going on there.
Yeah, I think the one major blind spot in my mind is that I worked a lot with big corporations, and a lot of the time I had, you know, discussions at the same time with various people in the same organization, and you would go in, and it was very rare, you know, I can count the cases on one hand where the messages kind of throughout all the different departments were the same that you received. Like, you know, a good example was at the time Everything Everywhere, when kind of they created, and you would talk to them, everybody would tell you the same kind of, you know, story. It was aligned. In the majority of cases, when you talk to kind of an organization, the conversations you have will vary. You will talk to people. One of the main thing I would say, have you spoken to so-and-so? They work on something similar. So there's, you know, there's what is happening inside the business, what is, you know, communicated out there, what is maybe one of the key drivers, but doesn't actually kind of, you know, move the needle and so on. Not everything is documented. Somebody might work on something, you know, a new proposition and you're offering, you know, you can track kind of similarly if you know want to build a competitive portal and you want to put in all the competitive kind of, you know, it said I can tell all the offers that your competitors have. Great, you can do data scraping and so on. It doesn't mean that you can, you know, speak to the competitors because there are deals that are not kind of, you know, visible to the public because they're done over the phone and so on. And this is where, you know, the information you get will let you down. And this is kind of a blind spot to remember that, you know, whatever you do will be great if you do it well, but it won't be perfect and it won't address kind of, you know, all the questions because of you know, not everything is digitalized yet. You know, not everything you have access to, rightly so, because, you know, I don't think you should have access to, you know, the call center discussions that your competitor is having and so on, unless you actually call them and run scenario-based works, which you can do. So there's a lot of kind of, you know, pitfalls like that. And I think people jump on it because they think it's gonna, you know, it's gonna change the world. And for sure it will, but it will take time. And it's kind of, you know, this step-by-step approach where, you know, most of the time what I try to do is to rein people in, you know, and to have those conversations, you know, what will you get out of it? And how, you know, what level of confidence do you need? I remember, you know, a project for a telco where they wanted to benchmark themselves against a number of operators. And, you know, and I looked at the data. And then, you know, the only way to convince them not to do it, because I think it would have been a giant waste of money, was to tell them, okay, can you go and get me the data, the financial data you're trying to get on your competitors from your finance people? And of course they couldn't. And, you know, the answer, you know, and asking what decisions are you trying to make based on that kind of, you know, benchmark comparison? And, you know, they couldn't answer the question. So sometimes, you know, there are a lot of projects that come from somewhere, you know, from a new, I don't know, COO, new strategy officer, and they think, you know, they're doing the right thing, or they've been told by one of the big kind of, you know, agencies they need to be doing that, but it doesn't really solve a problem, make sense. It doesn't mean that the data is clean and accessible. And then if you only have like, you know, 20% confidence in the data or the forecast that you receive, you know, then what's the point? Like, do you really want to make, you know, a decision and, you know, based off like 20% accuracy, which sometimes, you know, is the case, or even lower? So for me, the main blind spot is to make sure, you know, you do what is achievable, what can be done with the data you have at hand. And yes, you can go out and look at the data, but say, look at the data, look exactly what it gives you. And, you know, and don't use the data that you like because it tells a story that you like, you know, and that's the other kind of, you know, pitfall, because, you know, this is the human blind spot. You can train it, you can program it, but, you know, make sure it serves a purpose, it's accurate, it's the right data, because there have been some horrible decisions made based on, you know, the wrong data.
So a lot of people have been discussing here. One of the biggest causes of blind spot is bias, right? And I know
Yeah.
we're biased. We're all biased, And there's a big map out there called the cognitive, bias wheel, and it has all these different biases that we introduce. And you brought up a good point there that this happens to me a lot. Is my customers will be asking me to find the data that supports their hypotheses and ignore the data that doesn't. And we all have a tendency to do that. There's facts and there's real facts and there's all the facts, right? And so that's what bias does. And that in that's where psychology comes into this. Is what I really, going back to the beginning, I like about this is, there's a science to it, but there's also an art to it, and trying to understand that psychology behind that blind spot. Why are they thinking this? Why are they thinking that radio is better than my radio? What do they know about the competitor, customer that I don't know? Is there anything that we have that can help us detect those biases? Are we going in that direction? That's a tough one, right?
It is a tough one, and I can give you a very simple example of things that I learned to do, like any kind of especially like I love political polls. I love to take them apart and to look at exactly what questions were asked, because it's kind of there was even like I think it was like Yes Prime Minister episode where they do exactly that. Even if something as simple as building a questionnaire, you have so much bias, and you find, I've reviewed a lot, I've written some, there's always some bias. It's really hard to ask a truly objective question without kind of, having a purpose, because you have a purpose of why you do the poll in the first place, And so because of that, that's, you need to be aware of your own biases. And I'd like to think I am aware of some, but every day I discover that, I still have my biases. And even, in the way you look for information, and you build it. It's there. And you program the machines to do exactly the same, because you have one doing that.
Just to add on to that a little bit, bias can often just be the result of kind of bad experimental design, kind of like Olga mentioned about, phrasing. Like if you phrase a question about someone's support for policy a certain way, like, if you phrase it one way, they'll agree with it, and the other way they'll disagree with it. And so one tool that we have with us in statistics is pre-registration of your hypothesis. So essentially you lay out, what do I think the data is going to tell me about this? Or what do I think my study is going to reveal? Like, what do I expect to see out of this in advance before you ever actually look at the data? And that way you kind of avoid the temptation of going in and just finding whatever you want to look for, like torturing the data until it confesses, as people say. And so there are certain tools like that we can use to constrain ourselves.
Yeah. So when I often do a report out on something, I use a technique called nudge. There's a book out there called that, where you can phrase things in a certain manner that subtly that will kind of bias the decision that you're going to get out of your leader. You don't go and say, "Hey, they're beating our price." You go in there and say something like, we probably have some more flexibility in the way we approach the pricing of this. You use different phraseology, which is interesting. And I see that phraseology being used in earnings reports. It's really, I like dissecting them, because, they come out and they're talking to Wall Street and they're saying certain things, and we're saying, what are they really saying here? They just said this, just 2 days ago, Lockheed Martin came out and they took a 14% drop in their stock price right after that, because they said, hey, it's not going to be so good this next year, basically. But the way they phrased it, and they tried to rebound from that and say, but in 2023, gangbusters, they were trying to fix that a little bit. And it's just one, that phrasing is interesting to see, really interesting. So I guess we're going to be time's up here.
You never know, whether they were expecting a 30% drop based on end result, and then actually manages to get 14 because they did the press release the way they did.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, thank you very much to this panel. I feel like I'm interrupting, actually, even
Yeah.
though we're reaching time. There's so much to explore, and as anything in this summit, we're just scratching the surface of any of these topics. So there's a lot that we can still cover, and we will. So I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit at the end of the day. But thank you.